Hello, my name is Mickey Imura from the University of Oklahoma. In this presentation, I'm going to discuss my research proposal for one of my psychology courses called Teaching Psychology. The study I am proposing is Counterfactual Thinking in Academic Setting, Students' Affect, Motivation, Study Strategies, and Changes in their Test Score. When people face a negative situation, they often engage in counterfactual thinking, such as, if only I knew better. Counterfactual thinking is the kind of thoughts people engage in that is incongruent with the reality. So it's the imagination of how the situation could have turned out differently. For example, the lady who locked herself out of her car might think, if only I knew the key was in the car before shutting the door. Past studies have identified several types of counterfactual thoughts. Upward counterfactual is when people imagine how their outcome would have been better, thus comparing their situation to a fictional better situation. The earlier example, if only I knew the key was in the car before shutting the door, is an upward counterfactual thinking. Downward counterfactual, on the other hand, is when people imagine how their outcome would have been worse. For example, at least I locked myself out during a day when I can easily get help. Outward and downward counterfactuals provide different affective and functional states. Although upward counterfactual tends to induce negative emotions such as regret, disappointment, and shame, it prepares one for a similar situation in the future. On the other hand, downward counterfactuals lead people to feel positive affects such as satisfaction, and therefore future improvement is less anticipated. Macmillan and Markman further divided downward counterfactuals into subtypes of contrast and assimilation. They proposed that downward counterfactuals could produce both positive and negative affects. They called the traditional downward counterfactual, such as it's not as bad as it could have been, a contrast counterfactual or a Pangloss effect. Contrast produces positive affect but does not emphasize the need to change one's behavior in the future. There is another kind of downward counterfactual which can produce negative affects, such as, it really could have been worse than this. Macmillan and Markman called this an assimilation counterfactual or a wake-up call, and proposed that this kind of counterfactual could produce a behavioral change, thus serve as a preparation for the future. The research question of this proposed study is, how will various kinds of counterfactual thoughts influence college students' affects, motivation, and test scores? I will have college students go through upward counterfactual, downward assimilation counterfactual, downward contrast counterfactual, or no counterfactual a week before the second exam of the semester. I expect that upward and assimilation conditions will evoke negative affect in students, induce them to come up with more specific study strategies, and increase their test scores on exam 2, compared to those who engage in contrast or control. I also expect that those in the contrast condition will experience positive affect, but will not come up with specific study strategies and will not increase their test scores in exam 2 compared to other conditions. Approximately 300 students in introductory psychology at the University of Oklahoma will participate in the present study. The study will be conducted a week before the second exam in the class. The participants will be randomly divided into the upward counterfactual, downward assimilation counterfactual, downward contrast counterfactual, and no counterfactual control conditions. The participants will read the instruction appropriate to their respective counterfactual conditions. In the upward condition, adapting Mandel 2003, the participants will read, when people experience negative events, they sometimes think about how the event might not have happened if only something had been different. Then they will be asked to report the test score they received from the exam 1 and write down their if only thoughts on the exam. In the two downward counterfactual conditions, the instructions will state, people often think about how they could have done worse. For example, if someone gets B on the test, they might imagine that they could have received D. then they will be further instructed to imagine a specific grade that they could have received. The assimilation condition continues. Vividly imagine receiving the worst grade and describe your thoughts in writing. The contrast condition will say, evaluate your grade in comparison to the worst grade you imagined and describe your thoughts. Those in the control condition will be instructed to simply describe their thoughts on their exam 1 test score. These instructions have been validated to induce appropriate affective state in respective conditions. Following the counterfactual writing exercise, the participants will rate their affect on bipolar adjective rating scales such as bad, good, sad, happy, regret, satisfaction, and so on. The participants will also be instructed to write down as many study strategies as they intend to use for exam 2. The 2 research assistants who are blind to the conditions will code these strategies for their specificity. In order to control for the participants' academic achievement, I will include the overall grade they will make in introductory psychology at the end of the semester as a covariate. The resulting design will be an ANCOVA with the counterfactual conditions as the independent variable, the overall grade in introductory psychology as the covariate. The dependent variables will be the following: the participants' affective state when they engage in various counterfactual thinking, the number of study strategies they come up with as a proxy of motivation, the specificity of the study strategies as a proxy of the intention to change their future behavior, finally, the change in their test score as the measure of actual change in their outcome. For the dependent measure of affect, I expect the upward and assimilation conditions to rate their affect lower than the control and contrast conditions, and the contrast conditions to report an even higher affect than the control condition after controlling for the student's overall grades. Similarly, the upward and assimilation conditions should come up with a greater number of study strategies that are higher in specificity than the control, whereas the contrast condition will come up with fewer and less specific study strategies. Finally, I expect that the students in upward and assimilation conditions will show an increase in their exam 2 scores compared to their exam 1 scores, whereas those in the contrast and control conditions will show little to no change. I believe the present study contributes to the body of counterfactual research in several meaningful ways. First, it replicates the past findings of counterfactual thinking and the induced affects. This study also replicates the past findings of downward assimilation counterfactual producing greater motivation and downward contrast counterfactual producing less motivation in students' academic domain. I try to replicate this finding by having the students come up with as many study strategies as they can for the next exam, which is different from the traditional motivational measures such as Likert scale motivation measure. I believe that simply circling a number to agree with the sentence of how the student is going to start studying earlier will not indicate their current motivational state more accurately than actually coming up with the plans on their own. Thus, replicating the past findings of motivation with my measure of motivation should add credibility to the finding. Another contribution this study might make is the exploration of the relationship between the student's motivation and the actual outcome of the motivation, which was the exam score improvement. This relationship has never been tested to my knowledge, and the finding might cast a light to the possibility of using counterfactual thinking as a behavioral change intervention, especially in the domain of academics among students. For future research, a structural equation modeling of the relationship between counterfactual thoughts, affects, motivation, and change in behavior might be the next step, so that we can see if the number of study strategies or the specificity of study strategies mediate the relationship between counterfactual and the behavioral change. Well, that's it for now. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. If you have any questions, please email me at mikiko.imura@ou.edu. Thanks and have a good day.